We've come up north to talk with Anne-Marie LaRosa, Deputy Refuge Manager of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which includes an 8 million acre wilderness.
Welcome to Alaska, Chris, and what a great place to talk about wilderness.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. It certainly is. You know, I have to start out by saying that the #1 comment made by folks who work up here to those of us from the lower 49 is that things are different in Alaska.
Well, they are different, but not as much as you might think. There are some legally recognized traditional uses here, and Alaska wilderness is vast. Over 50% of the acres in the National Wilderness Preservation System are located in Alaska. That's over 58 million acres.
That's amazing. But tell me, now doesn't the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act direct you to manage wilderness differently here?
Well, it does, and some of those provisions are important for management. For instance, there's special provisions for access. But like the specifics of the organic legislation of any particular wilderness area, ANILCA modifies the details of management. The purpose of wilderness and the cornerstones of wilderness stewardship are the same no matter where you go in the system.
And those cornerstones are what we're interested in setting. So where should we start?
Well, as managers, we need to concern ourselves first with the cornerstone of managing wilderness as a whole resource with inseparable parts.
As opposed to?
As opposed to a collection of resources that we might manage independently. We need to consider the wilderness resource holistically, as a singular resource.
Singular resource.
Congress directed us in the Wilderness Act to secure for the American people an enduring resource of wilderness. That's resource singular. We need to plan for and manage wilderness in its entirety, not maximize an individual resource.
Can you give me an example?
Well, let's take, for instance, one purpose of wilderness, which is primitive and unconfined recreation. In almost 8 million acres of wilderness, we get only 2,000 visitors a year. Those visitors are all confined to a few river corridors and during a short Arctic summer. So we gathered together an interdisciplinary team with biologists and social scientists and managers. From some of our preliminary monitoring, we determined that the impacts to the biological and physical system, those to soil and vegetation and riparian resources, were not that significant at this time. But here's where we come to a better understanding of the stewardship aspect of our job and what it means to manage holistically. This is an area that millions don't visit, and it has a very special meaning to many people. So we needed to consider the wilderness character for present and future generations. So we set the bar very high, and we determined that we needed to limit group size in the Arctic Refuge to very small numbers. Wilderness is an important resource for all Americans, for those who visit and those who don't visit the wilderness area.
Another example that comes to mind is that you wouldn't want to increase wildlife habitat just so that there'd be more animals there.
Well, generally no, except if the animal was threatened or endangered. In that case, we have to satisfy both the intention of the Endangered Species Act and that of the Wilderness Act. So if that animal's habitat was threatened with loss or destruction, then we might take an action that we wouldn't take outside the wilderness to help recover that species.
Such as?
We might provide supplemental water. However, we would consider how we might do that action, and we might carry it out differently than we would in a non-wilderness area. If it were in a wilderness area, we wouldn't necessarily just drive up in a pickup truck and deliver the water to a stock tank.
But what if the place you administer was specifically set aside for a particular animal or group of animals?
And then it was designated wilderness?
Yes.
Well, in fact, that often happens in my agency. Many refuges were set aside for a particular species like bison or elk or Columbia white-tailed deer, or a group of species, for instance, migratory birds. And those are the purposes of the refuge. But wilderness is also a purpose of the refuge. And the Act specifically says each agency administering any area designated as wilderness shall so administer such area for such other purposes for which it may have been established, so also to preserve its wilderness character. In other words, wilderness doesn't take second fiddle to the other purposes for your area. it becomes one of those purposes.
And we manage it as a whole resource with inseparable parts. Thanks, Anne-Marie, for introducing us to the cornerstones of wilderness stewardship. Manage wilderness as a whole.